Welcome all. Thank you so much for joining today. This is hosted, of course, as you know, by the Rails to Trails Conservancy, TrailNation Collaborative, and I am Erica Briggs, Midwest Policy Manager for Rails to Trails Conservancy, and your host alongside my esteemed colleague, Drew Dupuy. Our topic for today is Pedal Forward, Preparing Advocacy Plans for 2025 State Legislative Sessions. And today's conversation will give us an opportunity to explore how to best position your active transportation and trail asks for upcoming state legislative sessions, most of which will occur in the winter and spring of 2025. So participants will hear how and have a chance to engage directly with their peers through breakouts and legislative priorities and best practices in their states. So we're hoping that by the end of this time that you will not only have learned something new, but hopefully made a new connection with a fellow practitioner and grown your network. Thank you. So today's session is hosted by the TrailNation Collaborative, Rail to Trails Conservancy's nationwide peer learning community that brings together leaders, advocates, and professionals from across disciplines to work together to establish and advance connected trail and active transportation networks across the country. To date, we have over 7,000 people who are signed up for the collaborative. The collaborative, if you have joined already, as you probably know, provides proven tools, methods, and resources, including the TrailNation Playbook, which is outstanding if you haven't had a chance to look at it yet. It's combined with RTC's expertise from our TrailNation projects and beyond, and that of you, our network of partners across the country. We come together to find solutions to challenges and barriers, working to accelerate the development of these connected trail systems. So before we get started, I just wanted to review the agenda real quickly. Just going to go through some housekeeping issues, and then RTC. Our team is going to be providing a Legislative 101 presentation, and then we are going to move over provide a presentation from our partners at Move Minnesota, and then we'll move into some breakout rooms where folks can discuss and collaborate, and then we'll come back all together in a big group for discussion and question and answers. So first, although we'll be starting with the Rails to Trails portion of the presentation, I wanted to introduce you to our panelists at Move Minnesota. We have Elissa Schufman and Nas Nourkadi, who will be joining and presenting later in the present webinar today. So Drew, I'm going to pass the presentation over your way.
Hey, thank you, Erica. My name is Andrew Dupuy. I am the Director of State Level Policy for Rails to Trails Conservancy, and just wanted to give a quick overview of what the kind of work that we do with state organizations and partners in states all around the country. Our policy work is primarily oriented around working to increase funding for active transportation and trail infrastructure, primarily working through state legislative appropriations, but also through agencies like Departments of Transportation, Departments of Natural Resources. The name varies state to state. We're also really working to build coalitions to replicate innovative policies, and we'll talk about some examples of that, including the one in the presentation, and just promote trail connectivity and protected biking and walking infrastructure as part of essential transportation networks. Next. So over the past decade or so, we've worked to support the securing of over $10 billion in new funding from states. This does not count federal funding that is distributed by states, like transportation alternatives, recreational trails program funding. We found that trail funding in particular is very bipartisan. We've seen major funding initiatives in very Republican states, especially Florida and Ohio and Utah, as well as Democratic states like California and New York, and in states where it really can be a bipartisan issue. So divided government states like North Carolina, for example, in the last few years have put forth a lot of new funding for active transportation and trail funding. We also do work to support better allocation of those federal funding. And just one other thing is that we've really seen that it is a popular issue across partisanship. Just a couple examples. We did, Rails to Trails commissioned a survey in 2020 that found that most Americans, including majorities of Republicans, and rural respondents supported increasing federal funding for biking and walking. A few years before that, we worked with partners in Tennessee to commission a University of Tennessee survey or poll that also found broad support across partisan lines, depending on where, including where people lived in different areas, that also found support for trails and supporting biking and walking. So we really see this as a winning political issue that can transcend changes in political dynamics and in budgetary cycles and so forth. Erica?
Yeah, thanks. So we just got done with election season, and this has been a great year for ballot campaigns. We've been seeing that for a number of years now. We're just highlighting here some of the ballot campaigns that the Rails to Trails Conservancy was engaged in. There were a lot of other ones across the country as well. You can see some of the headlines that we've pulled from newspapers across the country. But essentially, transportation ballot measures did really well in 2024. 87% of the transit measures passed in 2024. That's approximately $25 billion for biking and walking, and another $25 billion for transit. You can see here in Iowa, it's either from statewide to local ballot initiatives that we're highlighting here in Iowa, in Johnson and Story County. They passed conservation bonds that also had dedicated funding for trail funding. But you can also see that in the Columbus area in Ohio and central Ohio, voters there approved a new sales tax levy that will generate $60 million a year for new sidewalks, trails, and bike paths. Just by 2030, they're anticipating another being able to build 150 new miles of non-motorized connectivity into their network. So there's a wide way of range of ways that communities and states have addressed this, sometimes in collaboration and putting together more comprehensive packages, whether that's land and water conservation or climate mitigation or multimodal transportation, or if that's discrete funding, like in Maine, where voters approved a $30 million bond for trails. So although we're really going to focus today on sort of state legislative sessions, we wanted to make sure that we highlighted these wins, because this is another way to be able to be approaching this work in your state in collaboration with other partners. So we welcome you reaching out to us with questions for models or assistance. And you'll see in the chat, there's a link to a recent blog post that we've put together on this topic. So back to you, Drew.
Thanks, Erica. Yeah, and one other thing about the ballot initiatives, the Iowa one, where Johnson and Story County, those are both counties anchored by college towns. There was a situation where there was a statewide voter-created funding pot that the legislature had not put money into. And so these two counties went out on their own and did this themselves and put this on the ballot to their own voters and passed pretty substantial amounts of money, $30 and $25 million each, in these local counties. So we think this is an interesting model in case where a state might be unwilling to fund trails or other active transportation, but depending on state laws and the ability of a municipality or a county to put their own funding initiative on the ballot, they might be able to kind of do it themselves. So anyway, pivoting back to the forthcoming legislative sessions, I think we have an array of people, and some people on this call are probably very well versed in working with legislatures, and other people might be new. So we can talk more in a little more detail at the end in the Q&A. But just a couple things. I mean, as Erica said, most legislatures are part-time, and most meet kind of in the January to May period. The majority of legislatures have adjourned by Memorial Day. It might be a little late for this, but often a good place to get funding proposals in is to work with your governor's office, lobby your governor, or the executive agency that puts out the initial budget proposal. And the timing of that really varies by state, and you kind of have to ask people in the know for what the right timing is. But Usually the governor, or when I worked in the Texas legislature, it was called the Legislative Budget Board. They would put out an initial proposal before legislative session that the legislators will then amend and change and approve. So if you can get something in on the front end, it's often more likely that it's going to make it through than trying to, add it into an existing budget proposal. There are other cases or state I'm working with now where they propose some cuts to some programs that we're concerned about, but they're in a revision process right now. So we are still trying to work with the agency and the governor to kind of rescind some of those cuts. You probably about now should be finalizing your legislative agenda for your organization, and whether that could be you pushing bills yourself or looking around at other coalition partners and what's out there and saying, like, these are our priorities, whether that's on offense or defense. And so we can talk more about that later. Some states, it's a bigger deal to pre-file, and you might want to look up what your pre-filing deadline or date is. And I think that lining up bills, if you're the lead on this bill, you probably want to line up your bill sponsors. I've seen some cases where I think bills would have passed had they had their bill sponsor lined up right out of the gate before session started. This is something I think I want to talk more about at the end because I think for some people this is going to be pretty obvious, and other people this is going to be new. There's a lot to discuss about how to educate legislators and staff. Do not sleep on staff. Staff often run the show, and often they might have different issues in their portfolio. You might have a transportation expert or a budget expert or something like that. And don't think that if you only can meet with the legislator, that's the only thing of value. There's also just, there's educating them. Maybe the bill's not up yet, but if you can go in and underscore that there's a lot of support in their district for trails and for biking and walking, it can help, grease the wheels a little bit. And I think what we're looking at this year is that a lot of state budgets are going to start to be a little tighter going forward. A lot of federal money that's been coming is going to start to, taper off. And some states are seeing some lower budget forecasts, and some are even projecting cuts. And if you've gotten out there and talked about the value of your program and that there's support in these legislators' districts, when the tough decisions are made about what to cut, your program might be, protected a little bit more or inoculated more than something that a legislator or a appropriations member knows nothing about. And there's all kinds of other things you can do, legislative alerts and things like that. Again, happy to field questions at the end about this after the presentation. One thing I would point you to, and I think there should be a link going into the chat right now, is states have very different laws about lobbying. And if you're doing a fair amount of this, you probably should protect yourself and just look these up. We have a link to a website that has lobbying laws for all states. And this is not just about the amount of hours you can do, but how much you need to disclose and report. A lot of states are wide open and very loose about this, and other states are fairly strict. So just make sure you know what's going on with that. I list up advocacy days. Those are a bigger lift. Happy to discuss those and talk about those more, but they can be really effective. And then the last thing is I'm starting kind of probably monthly during a peak legislative session in the spring call. Just really quick 30 minutes where we can swap ideas about what people are working on, see if we can troubleshoot any challenges, or you can get some ideas. And if you're lobbying or pushing any bills in your legislature or trying to figure out how to get that going, I encourage you to sign up. There's just a Google form to sign up, and I will follow up with you with the the Zoom link and all that. The first one will be about a month from now, at the same time this Wednesday. It'll be on a Wednesday at the same time as this.
Thanks so much, Drew. And obviously, we'll talk about this more at the end of the call. We are excited to work with everybody across the country and moving this type of work forward. So I'm going to pass the presentation over to our friends Elissa and Nas over at Move Minnesota. Their legislative wins over the last couple of years have really garnered national attention, which is why we wanted to bring them to this conversation today. So even if you're not working through this same framework, and we think that there's a lot to learn about the approach that they have used here. So Elissa or Nas?
I can kick us off. Hey, everybody. Elissa Schufman. I use she and they pronouns. I am the Interim Executive Director at Move Minnesota. Next slide. I'll just walk us through briefly our agenda today and have Nas introduce himself, and then we'll get started. So um, uh, we'll start a little bit with talking about who we are at Move Minnesota, some of the things that we won, how we got there, and then we'll obviously have lots of time for discussion and Q&A at the end. Nas, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I am Nas. I'm our policy and community specialist, and I'm really excited to talk to you all today about some of the tactics that we use to be able to accomplish these things. Thank you.
Thanks. And it's been really great to see folks in the chat introducing themselves as well. So appreciate getting to know other folks in the room. So no, there's a lot of expertise and experience here, but as others already said, hope that by sharing about some of our recent wins and strategies for getting there, we can help spark some new ideas or help you all think about a different strategy that might support your work. So we're past the Move Minnesota slide, but Move Minnesota is a 501c3 nonprofit. Our mission is to lead the movement for a sustainable and equitable transportation system that puts people first. Our vision is to create a Minnesota where our transportation system breaks down barriers, protects climate and environment, and creates access and choice. We connect people to our transit system where it's working well, and we fight hard to make sure our transit, biking, and walking systems are working well for everyone. Next slide. We also have a 501c4 subsidiary. I'm not going to talk a lot about this on this call, but just wanted folks to be aware that in our toolkit of holding elected folks accountable for the decisions that they make, it's important for us as an organization in our overall strategy that we have a 501c4 that endorses candidates and does other electoral work. Next slide. So I will spend a little bit just talking about what is of what we won, and then Nas will take over to talk a little bit about how we got there. Next slide. The law that we're going to be highlighting today is what we're calling the Driving Down Emissions Law, which limits highway expansion and also requires regional long-range planning goals to account for climate. You might be wondering, but you're a transit organization. This is about cars. Yes, it is about cars, because reducing driving we see as kind of the flip side of the coin around sustainable transportation, right? Reducing driving isn't about reducing driving. It's about making sure that all the things we collectively care about on this call, walking, biking, transit, climate action, racial justice, have the resources that they need, and we stop sinking all of our resources into car infrastructure. Next slide. So on the planning side, the law requires that our regional metropolitan planning organization, our MPO, now has to think about climate when doing its comprehensive planning process. So right now in the Twin Cities, our region's 2050 planning process is already underway, and it's really exciting that climate mitigation and adaptation are now required to be incorporated into the comprehensive planning process. So folks have to think about things like the climate impacts of urban sprawl. Next slide. On the curbing highway expansion side, this graphic seems complicated. I'll try to explain it in a really straightforward way, but our initial win in 2023, we built on that win in 2024, was focused on stopping highway expansions specifically. It required that any expansion project, basically projects that add lanes, had to evaluate the climate impacts, and if the project did not reduce driving and climate emissions in alignment with our state goals, it couldn't move forward. Because of how induced demand works, where people are more likely to drive when it's easier, adding lanes means a project is inherently weighted towards increasing driving and climate pollution. So we included a clause where expansion projects are still allowed if they mitigate those climate impacts with offsetting new investments in transit, biking, and walking, so that the package of projects together reduces driving and climate pollution. Next slide. As part of rolling out version 1 of that legislation, we ensured we had a seat on the mitigation working group that met through 2023 and into 2024, which was basically charged with figuring out how do we implement this law. And we leveraged those conversations to really set the stage for expanding and improving the law in 2024. As a tangible example, we heard in this process from many county engineers that the interlinked nature of transportation makes it really hard to measure the impacts of a single expansion project. And that's true because people who drive a given stretch of highway come from all over. Duluth, for example, is 150 miles from Minneapolis. If we're removing lanes on 35, which connects those two cities, that can impact travel patterns all over on a variety of roads. It's not just on the single project. So that's why our modeling happens across the transportation system in Minnesota. Next slide. So we took that opposition from those engineers and we leveraged it into our 2024 law, which doesn't just focus on highway expansion projects. It says that MnDOT's entire portfolio of highway projects has to reduce driving because that's what we have the best ability to measure. Next slide. We also set the stage for what we can do in the future on local roads. We know while most of the driving in Minnesota happens on highways, it's about 60%. Local roads are often the places where those transit, biking, and walking investments can most easily and effectively replace shorter trips. So I wanted to set the stage to for that future work to not just require MnDOT highways, but local jurisdictions and local roads to plan for reducing driving and climate. Next slide. Another note I want to make about the mitigation efforts is that they are not cost effective. So we are not the first state to work on vehicle miles traveled reduction, VMT reduction, driving reduction. Our partners in Colorado, who you'll hear a little bit more about later, did a lot of work around this that we were able to build on. And we saw in Colorado, as a result of this work, that the price tag of mitigation is functionally way too high for states to do it. Minnesota as a state is already struggling to keep up with the cost of maintaining the roads it has built, and we don't have the funds to be doubling the cost of every single expansion project. So at this point, we're anticipating seeing a lot of canceled highway expansions and a lot of right-sizing projects for climate in the future. Next slide. That said, this is all still rolling out. The technical advisory committee that is meeting once or twice a month to figure out what this looks like, to be an accountability partner, is just getting underway. They started meetings this September and are working to finalize the process of what does it actually look like to evaluate a project before that first deadline in February of 2025. One of the downsides to implementing nation-leading policy is you don't actually know how it's going to pan out in the implementation phase. We don't have another state to look to who has done exactly the same thing. So we're continuing to be active and engage with this work as an accountability partner and through this implementation phase. Next slide. As this work evolves, I'll just emphasize again, this is two sides of the same coin. Reducing driving is about increasing walking, biking, transit, all the things we care about. And you know, this particular policy mechanism is a how, right? It's how we get to the thing we want. It's not the end result of the thing we want. Getting cars off the road is great, but it's about those connected communities. It's about climate. It's about racial justice, about all those things. So I'll drop a couple links in the chat that go through some of this policy in more detail. But for now, I will turn it over to Nas to talk a little bit about how we got there.
Hi there, everybody. Thanks so much. Thank you, Elissa. It always sucks going after you, but I will do my best. Also, Elissa was a little bit under the weather today, so that was especially incredible. Thank you so much. Okay, so how we got there. It's important to note that victories don't happen overnight, and especially as we're facing a federal environment in the future that's less friendly, it's important to remember that the work takes time. And a lot of the work we did over the last few years happened under a similar administration. So history really repeats itself. Next slide. Ongoing grassroots advocacy. Our coalition and the work we've been doing in Minnesota has been going on for a really long time. Some of the work that went into transportation for that coalition and other work when it came to grassroots advocacy building, connecting with other networks, building relationships with legislators. These are things that happened over 10 years here in Minnesota. So it took a really long time and there were a lot of losses along the way. Next slide. And it's important to note that some of those friends in our coalition are from all over the place. We had climate groups, transit advocacy groups, people who did policy development, people who dabbled in active transportation, faith-based advocacy groups, people who worked with BIPOC communities, unions, etc. Our coalition was extremely broad. And why was it so broad? Next slide. Our coalition was broad because our narrative was broad. We make sure in Minnesota that when our legislators are saying no to more transportation forward and climate forward legislation, that they're not just saying no to one of those concepts. When you're saying no to our bills, you're saying no to equity, you're saying no to climate, you're saying no to job access, to public health, to education, the list goes on. And it's important to have those groups represented not only in your coalition, but in your legislation as well. And that's what we did here. Thanks so much. Next slide. Advancing a vision. It's important that when you're advancing a vision that you're doing the work to instill the future of the legislation you're advocating for. VMT reduction activates loss since it's about reducing something. Needing to stay focused on something positive is super important to continue that traction. And also when you're asking for something like dedicated funding, it's important here in Minnesota that we had an idea of what that might look like. So maintaining that positivity as well as having a clear vision was super important to us. Next slide. Leveraging plans. So a lot of the work that happened here in Minnesota wasn't just about grassroots advocacy. It was also about leveraging government mechanisms and flow here in the state. So the Department of Transportation had worked on for a while and published a report about pathways to decarbonizing transportation in Minnesota. And some of the conclusions they came to were less favorable to our cause, whether it was about the EV market or promoting EV infrastructure or biofuels. It wasn't completely aligned with us. But in this report, they had recognized maybe a lack of scope and expertise, and therefore had created the Sustainable Transportation Advisory Council, STAC, as a means of investigating more ways to decarbonizing. And how did we leverage this mechanism into legislation? Next slide. We made sure to influence and work with that committee. We had people on there, transit advocates, and also people favorable towards greenhouse gas reduction that were able to make recommendations. So this advisory council was split up into two committees, one being electrification and the other being a more multimodal approach system. And one of their recommendations were a 20% reduction in vehicle miles traveled, which was, I think, a metric gotten from Delaware, readjusted to Minnesota, and they had also recommended a moratorium on highway expansion. Next slide. So to summarize what I was saying, this report had led to a committee that created another report that we were able to use when it came to the legislature. So in this statewide multimodal transportation plan, we were able to cite that our Department of Transportation had recommended a 20% reduction in vehicle miles traveled. This grants us a lot of legitimacy when talking to legislators, as it doesn't just sound like our climate advocacy groups are talking about this. These requests are coming internally from our government as well, which is super helpful. Next slide. And it's important to mention that similar legislation, not exactly identical, had happen elsewhere in Colorado. So it was easier to quell fears from legislators, from other decision makers, from influential voices that we could cite them. Next slide. And speaking of them, we're specifically talking about our friends at the Rocky Mountain Institute, who do a lot of wonderful policy development over in Colorado. And we're able to bring them out to either testify, to talk with us to legislators, to be able to speak to a model of a moratorium on highway expansion limitations, which is super wonderful. Next slide. And it's also important to note that we made the active choice this session to let other bills take the spotlight. We flew under the radar to be able to push our legislation forward because our legislation was complicated and some conversations were easier. When we can have more forward-facing and honest conversations with legislators, we're not approaching fears that their constituency might have or that other powers that be might have, and rather we can have candid conversations with legislators about our dreams for transportation and the climate. Next slide. And it's also important to mention that some of our champions were strategically decided. Larry Kraft is super wonderful. Some of you might be familiar with him. He's a suburban legislator, and it was his first time around. And he was completely wonderful. He was able to speak to everybody on our aisle and across candidly, and was just like a figure of authority and trust. So we made sure to choose the right person for the job. Next slide. And the last thing we'll say for our strategy is that it's also important that we made sure that our agenda at the legislature was in line not only with our base, but also just the general Minnesota constituency. We'd found strong support across demographics where people wanted to move funding away from highway expansion to improve other transportation projects across most demographics, except Republicans, which was actually about an even split when you take into consideration the amount of people that weren't sure, the little gray highlighted section. Next slide. And just in summary, these are a lot of the tools that we used to be able to get these bills across, whether it was advocacy, coalition work, narratives, advancing a vision, leveraging plans, influencing committees, and everything else we had mentioned. It was a very multifaceted approach, and we're happy to talk to anybody about it in depth if you reach out to us at any time. Next slide. Yeah, and thank you so much, and I'll let this presentation go back in the hands of our friends from Rails to Trails. But yeah, feel free to reach out to us, please.
Amazing. Thank you so much. That was such a huge portion, lots of information, such good information. Thank you so much, Nas and Elissa. So we hold on to the questions that you have about this. But right now we're going to move into breakout rooms. As a reminder, breakouts won't be recorded. We will have RTC staff and our panelists will be there to take notes. But just feel free to lead conversations and speak freely. We'll be in the rooms for, maybe about between 10 and 15 minutes. And you'll see a 1-minute countdown before we come back for the general question and answer session. So while our speakers listen, Nas will be in the helping to facilitate the breakout rooms. We ask that you use this time for discussion with your peers. You can see some questions that we have here for you to think about and save those big questions for the question and answer portion of the session. So see you guys back in about 10 or 15. Drew, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the things that came up maybe in your breakout room?
Well, I could. We talked a bit more about Indiana's Next Level Trails program, which I think came up earlier as a really lucrative and competitive grant program within the state. We had a couple people from the Department of Natural Resources there, and that's a program and a state that we often really like to highlight. So we talked about that, but I don't know how transferable that. I mean, we talked about that and other innovative programs around the country, like California's active transportation program, where rather than having to apply for funding in sort of a piecemeal fashion, California has sort of consolidated it all under one umbrella to really facilitate accessing that funding. And that's something that we've encouraged other states to do. I think Minnesota comes to mind as a state that their chairman of transportation finance some years ago put this in a budget amendment to kind of consolidate some of those programs. So, that's something we like to share, that kind of innovation and ways to kind of make accessing federal and state funding easier.
Great. And not seeing any questions that have come up necessarily yet for our panelists, but I'd love to hear if there's anybody who's wants to share some more innovative or unique legislation that they're perhaps pursuing.
Seems all quiet on the home front here. I mean, I'll jump in for a minute. Hi, Andrew and company. The breakout session, here by Mary Ellen, was very informative, I thought, and I got more airtime than I bargained on, but I rattled away a little bit what's going on here in New Hampshire. And Andrew, shout out to Ryan on the side too. Well, legislation we're currently underway with is looking at the national issue of devices that are not e-bikes, but they're being sold as e-bikes 50, 60 miles an hour on trails, roads, natural surface trails, you name it. And they're getting away scot-free with no license, no registration, no safety. People are being injured, being scared out of the wits on trails. So we've established a connection between OHRV groups, the equestrians, the mountain bike groups, the handicapped, if you would, and basically a whole coalition where we're trying to advance legislation to get our hands around the whole thing. And we work with you folks at RTC earlier and other national groups. Andrew knows some of the background of that. We're still working it, but basic thing we're told right now is there's no money in the budget. State budgets being cut 4% across the board from what was funded in 24. So if you put in a bill that's going to have anything in it, the way of education, safety, registration, or anything, it probably won't fly because there's no money, no money, no money, and having less money than last year. So again, advocacy, connecting the groups together, I feel is very important. But as also said through Mary Ellen, money, money, money can sometimes tilt the scales and not in our favor. So again, appreciate this webinar today and a chance to hear a little about what's going on in our small state of New Hampshire, and we're still doing what we can. So thank you. Eric, going back to
Okay.
you.
Thanks, Dave.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. That was helpful. And People for Bikes just had some real interesting guidance that they put on the subject that you were talking about. So you might be able to share that with you later as well. I'm curious, if there's certainly there's any struggles that folks are having with legislative agenda development. This is a good time to raise that. We've got a couple of minutes. You're welcome to throw out a question.
Elissa, could you share some of the discussion about influencing DOT culture? Because I think that's an interesting topic.
Sure, I can, and I'll speak just to Minnesota. Other folks, I'll let other folks speak to their states if they want to chime in. But yeah, someone just sort of raised a question about how do we do some of these transformative things, like some of the stuff Minnesota was able to accomplish, thinking about DOT culture as often really like ingrained in car culture. And here in Minnesota, I would say a lot of our success has had to do with sort of building up future leaders. Minnesota as a state is very, likes to promote from within and very directly, right? And so we know within MnDOT that like people will just be promoted up the ladder eventually. And so when we had a DOT, our commissioner changed a number of years ago, we were able to leverage some of the relationship building we did like a level down or a couple levels down. And as those leaders like were promoted into different positions, able to have a little bit more of a neutral to positive culture around some of the things we're advocating for than we did previously. So I know other folks have other thoughts about how they're doing that work within their states. But that's a strategy that's been really important for us, is to be sort of building those ongoing relationships and be able to, when those folks step into stronger leadership positions, make sure that we're, if not able to move them in support of our issue, at least have them not stand in the way of some of the things we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, I think we're at a point of a lot of cultural change within DOTs. And it doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily synced like the way that a state is like on the political level and how the DOT culture is. They can sometimes be out of sync. So I do think it is. I think we're at a point where DOTs are getting a lot more open to multimodal approaches. I remember one head of a state DOT sent out a all staff memo that says we are not the Department of Roads, we are the Department of all forms of transportation. And I think that that's really encouraging, but I think you do have to kind of, like Elissa was saying, continue to kind of lean on them and lean on the legislators who have oversight on transportation to ensure that all modes are considered, and it's not just about roads and highway expansion.
Great. Well, we have run out of times today. Thank you so much, Elissa and Nas, for joining us today. Really great to hear the work that you're doing I also want to make sure that we let folks know about the upcoming TrailNation Collaborative events. You can see here some of the upcoming webinars that we have in front of us. Part 2 of Working with Railroads is happening on the 21st, and post-election landscape, next steps for the trail and active transportation movement is on December 3rd, and then advocating for high-performing transportation alternative program on December 9th. So you can find out more information on our webinars page, and always, if you missed this, you can find the recordings later on. So thank you all for attending and joining with us today. And we hope to see you at our next session. And we hope that everybody has a wonderful day.